Today we're going to learn about items and assemblies in Quantify. And to do this, we're going to go into the Database Manager. And on the left-hand side, we're going to be working in the Items and Assemblies databases. Now, the one thing to know about both of these databases is that anything in the global database, which would be any of these folders we have here that come with Quantify, are not editable. So if I go in and open up one of these items in here, you can see all the line items, variables, everything that's in here, but you can't edit it because this is an item that's part of the global database, which means everyone has access to it. Now, if you want to make any changes to something in here, if you want to customize anything, you can right-click on the item or assembly, it works in both cases, and click Copy Item. And then where you want to put it is up to you. If you want to put it right in this same folder, I can right click on the folder and click Paste Item. Most people, however, want to create their own folder of all of their items and assemblies. And to do that, you can simply right click on the main folder, click Add Item. We'll call this My Items. And instead of an item, this is a folder. Click Save. And we can see this folder here. Now when I click it, right click and paste the item that I copied, this is going to refresh the list and we'll see the item in there. So there we go. We open this up and we see there's our item. Now it is appended -copy to the end to let you know that this is a copy. And if you want to edit this, you can, and we can call this My Item. Save that, and that's renamed it. Now if you want to go in here and let's say you want to adjust the labor rate for this, I want this at 7. I can change that, and if I double click to refresh it, we'll see that it has stayed at 7. So you can change whatever you want in here now that you've created a copy of this item. One thing to be aware of when you are making any changes is the 4 drop-down menus that are up top here. So we can see for this wire, the labor and the price are both per 1,000. So this 7 hours per 1,000 feet. And the price that you're going to see in here is per 1,000, again, feet. And this is just so you have all these different options. If you're entering in, plugs or switches, it might be each or 100 or whatever it is. It's however you want to put in that labor rate or that quantity or that pricing for it. The unit item is what the price and labor are based on. So in this case, it's feet. And then display items is used for what you're going to see in the summary screen. So if you leave this on estimate default, then when I go back here to the estimate screen, whatever I select, imperial or metric, is what it's going to show. If I come back here, if I force this into metric, then even though everything here is per foot, and when I go to take off an imperial job, I'm going to take off this wire in feet, and it takes off 100 feet of wire, and that's fine. But when I go to my summary screen, it's going to do the conversion for you. So in the summary screen, you're going to see it in the metric value. And this can be useful for things like wire, where you might be taking it off in feet, but the supplier wants to see it in metric because that's how they price their wire. So if you're sending that summary screen over to them and it's already converted it over, makes their life easier and less chance of a mistake. So that's where you use the display units here. If you want to create your own item from scratch, maybe you can't find something in the global items database that is similar to what you want to make, or you can't find what you want to change, and you need to make something from scratch. That's fine. It is easier if you can find something similar. But if you need to make it from scratch, we can right click and click Add Item. We'll give it a name, and let's call this one Demolition Lights. And this is not a folder, it's an item. And I'm going to click Save. And when I double click this, we see it says no variables are assigned to this item. So what we have to do first is right click and edit the variables, because every item needs at least one variable. And for this demolition, maybe we don't actually want to have a variable. We just want to put in a labor value for demolishing this type of light. In that case, under type, we have different selections here. So if it's an attribute, that gets a subtype. Only attributes get subtypes. And these subtypes is a dimension, if it's a certain length that you're going to select, a wire gauge, a count for maybe number of conductors, amps, watts, that sort of thing. And we don't want that. A decimal, which is commonly used, that's for entering something like a drop length. You're telling the user, I want you to enter a decimal value. It could be 8, could be 5.2, whatever it is. A text type is where you're either selecting a text option or you're asking the user to enter in a text option. And finally, the null type is what we're going to use here. This is when I don't want a variable, I just want to enter in a single labor value for this item. So we say null, be sure to click the plus button and click close. Now when I double click it, we can see there is nothing here in this column. And I'm going to say for this light, it is going to take me 0.2 hours to demolish it. Scroll over, click the plus button, and there it goes in. And if we go back in here to the global database, I can show you stuff, receptacles that uses this. So here's a 15 amp receptacle. And we can see again, it's a null type. So if I right click and edit the variables, we can see the variables here. It's a null type that has no subtype because it's not an attribute. And it's just put in 30 hours per 100 for the labor. If you want to use something other than a null type, let's say we want to add in an item and we want this to be an LED light. Maybe it's a new type of light that we don't have yet. Again, if you can find something similar, if you copy from that, change what's there, that's a lot easier. But if you do want to make it yourself, again, no variables. So we right click, edit the variable, and let's do this by watts. So we're going to look at attributes, and then down here we see watt. So that's going to be what we use. We're going to add that in, hit close, double click it. So lights are something that are commonly created by a lot of other users, and you enter in lights with watts like we set it up with. The one catch here with the items is the way our database works is it was always designed for imperial first, which usually isn't a problem. So if you're entering in wire, the gauge is going to be in, the number gauge rather than the millimeters. And if you need that millimeters, the system will convert it for you. Lights, however, are a little different because the system is expecting you to enter in the horsepower to convert it to watts for you, but no one does lights by horsepower. So to overcome this, the display units that we talked about before, we simply have to set this to metric. Once we do that, I can enter in 150 W, 0.1 hours to install, and I'm doing this as an each. Scroll over, click the plus sign, and there it goes in. If I want 250 watts, maybe that's going to take the same amount of time. I can scroll over and add that in. What this is going to do, if I open this estimate, is so I'm going to select my item here, my LED light, and we can see it's given me my option. So if I have my 250 watt light, I highlight it, commit it, go to the summary screen, and we can see there's our LED light, one of them, and it's got the 250 watts there. There is another way of creating items, especially when you're dealing with stuff like lights, and it can be used for other things. So we've entered this in as watts. If I go to create an item and we call it another LED light, we'll save that, right click, edit the variables, same thing. We'll enter in watts. Or maybe we don't want to call it watts, maybe we want to call it type. And then the type here we're going to set to text. and there's no subtype because subtype is only used for attributes. Click the plus button, then click close, and once we double click this, we can see that we can enter in type, and we can enter text here. I can enter 250 watts. That takes 0.1 hours, and I can add that in. I can type in a recess type that takes half an hour, and I can put that in. I could also have a demolition type that takes 0.2 hours, and I can enter that one in. So because this is a text type, you can enter in the 250 watt, you can enter in demo, you can enter in whatever you want. And when I go to take this off, it's simply going to let me select here. So if I select my 250 watt light and I take one of them off, and then I'll do the same thing and I'll say this is for demo, and I'll take two of those off. When I go to my summary, we can see here that we have another LED light that's 250 watts. That's the size. So even though this item was set to an actual wattage size of 250 watts, and this item had a text size of 250 W, they're both going to look the same to your supplier. And then for this takeoff item here that we demoed 2 lights, that's the size you're getting there, so you know that's for demolition. So there are multiple ways of creating items, and the one downside if you are going to use this text-based item is that you can't switch between metric and imperial, obviously, because everything here is just text-based. So if you were entering something in, maybe it was length-based and you had some items here in feet, and then you had other different text there, you can't have the system convert it to metric because it doesn't know what it is. All it knows is that it's straight text. That's the one downside of any items that use text variables. You cannot convert between metric and imperial. If it's something like for lighting, where there is no real lighting is never sold with imperial, it's always done in watts no matter what, then text variables may be a good way to go. Another thing to point out is the area up top here, and you can see you can upload icons if you'd like for these items. These icons will show up in the quick item pads. When you go into the quick item pad and you go onto the icon list, you'll see it in there. And the thing to be aware of here is, like it says, it needs to be 48 by 48 pixels, and it needs to be in PNG format. You can also upload a cut sheet if you'd like, and this is in the summary screen. When you see those yellow icons for your shop drawings, anything you upload for an item here will bring that shop drawing up whenever you take it off. Likewise, you can also upload a Revit file in either RFA or zip, and you'll see a blue icon next to it, similar to the yellow one in the summary screen if you want access to those Revit files. The shape selections here are used as the default tool if you take off just this item. So this item is going to be taken off with a rectangle. Rectangle is always the default selection. If you were making wire or conduit as an item, you'd probably want to select the line tool. Or maybe this is a pot light and you want to make it a circular light instead. Just be sure that this is the default tool that you're selecting when you take off the item. This doesn't apply to assemblies because the assembly is filled with multiple items and it has its own takeoff tool. So let's move over to assemblies now. And the same rules apply to assemblies. So anything that is in the global item database or the global assembly database cannot be edited. You can go and see what's in here. You can also right click and copy, same as items. So if I copy this, click on my folder, paste the assembly in here, it's going to show up on the bottom. Same thing, I can rename it to my plug. And there we go, that's renamed. And the way these assemblies work, everything is formula driven. So you have variables and you have all the items in the assembly, and then you have, with sizes and quantities, you have formulas. And if I go into takeoff here and I select my assembly we just made, we can see it's asking on the attributes for the gauge, the drop length, and the quantity. That's because we have gauge, drop length, and quantity. So the variables that you see here are the selections you're going to be asked for on the right-hand side. If you have something with more variables, you're going to have more selections. So the way this works is whatever variables that you see down here in the item editor. So we see we're using a gauge, we're using drop length, and we're using quantity. Those are the variables that we need to see up here. If I click the edit button for this cable, we can see that it's asking for the gauge, which we had selected the variable gauge. And for the number C, which is number of conductors, we can see down here, it was set to 3. So if we wanted to change this, and I said, I don't want to be asked for the gauge every time. I just want this to be 12 gauge and 3 conductor every time. We can set that. I hit confirm. This changes it. So it's going to use a 12 and a 3 every time. Now we don't see gauge anywhere else here. So we can delete this variable. And if we go back, refresh our page, grab our same assembly here, we can see it's not asking me for that gauge anymore. So if I take this off, bring up our audit trail, we can see here the cable came in with a number 12 and a 3 conductor wire. So even though we didn't select the gauge, we didn't have to select it now. It's just hard baked in. We've said it's 12/3 every time. I'm going to open this up to edit it again, and you're going to see the way we type in our variables. It's similar to Excel. It always starts with this equal sign here. And then any variables that you're typing in have to be inside square brackets. And you'll see that here. All the variables are listed with these square brackets. So that's how they have to be typed. And you'll see quantity here has a small q, drop length has a big D, a big L, and a space in between. So how you see it typed here in the variables list is how you have to type the variable down here. If I go to change this, and let's say I start over and I type in quantity, and I confirm that, then when I go to take this off, and let's clean this up a little bit here. When I go to take this off, I'm going to take it off, I'm going to right click it, and it's going to give me an error. Because what I did is I didn't type quantity, I made a spelling mistake. I typed quantify instead. And the error will try to lead you in the right direction. So it says it's a parse error, column 0, it's an unknown character, and it tells you this is the problem. So we see, oh, quantify, that's not right. So when we come back here, we can check and say, there it is, that's the quantify one. I'm going to edit that and fix my spelling mistake. Hit confirm, we come back, refresh the page, grab our assembly again, and now when I take it off, everything works out. So if you do get errors like that after you've edited an assembly or created your own, it's most likely just an error, just some sort of mistake in your formulas, and it's usually some sort of spelling mistake or you forgot a bracket somewhere. So just go through and double check. This is another reason why, same as the items, if you can find assemblies that are similar to what you want to make, and you can make a copy of those and paste them, that's a lot easier, faster, and you'll end up making a lot less mistakes than if you make something from scratch. But if we do want to make something from scratch, it's the same process as with the items. We want to right click on our folder, click add folder or assembly, and give our new assembly a name. Let's call this one a plug, or maybe my plug. And this is an assembly that we're going to make, so we'll click save. Then if I double click on this assembly, we can see that it is empty. So the first thing we want to do is you want to understand what kind of items we want to put in here. So we're going to have a receptacle, a plate, a box, some morettes. These are things we want to add. So we have our items database over here. So if I type in, let's say Legrand, and this is going to pull up everything we have from them. Now, if I find a receptacle that I like here, let's go with this receptacle with a USB. I'm going to double click this, and it's going to ask me what the quantity is going to be. And this is where everything you enter in is formula based. You can enter in just a static number, but at the very least, you usually want it to be equal to just the quantity takeoff, so that every time you're clicking that takeoff on the takeoff screen, it's going to add 1 to that quantity. And if I hover over the question mark here, it kind of gives you a couple examples of how these formulas work. So it's always going to start with equals, and our variables are always going to be in square brackets. So let's type that right, and then there's equals quantity. And we can see up here our variable is listed in square brackets, and it uses a small q, so that's what we use here. If I want to add in a device box, and let's add in this one. So this has the same thing. We have to add in what our quantity formula is, but it's asking what the number of gangs are. So this item has line items that have different options here. And if we drop this down, we can see here's our options. So if you want to hard bake in that I want this to be a single gang for this assembly every time, no problem. I can select this, put in my formula, and away we go. Equals quantity. If I don't want to hard bake that in, but I want this to be a selection that I'm going to choose the gangs, then I need to add that variable in here. So let's call this gangs, and this is going to be an attribute of a count type. So we're selecting how many, we're counting how many gangs are in there. I'm going to add that in. And then if I edit this device box, I can select this variable now instead of hard coding it in. So I'm going to confirm that. Now if we go over to the takeoff screen and I go to select my assemblies, I select my plug, double click it, it's going to ask me how many gangs I want here. So let's go back to our assembly and let's add in a plate. So we'll type plate, hit search, and if I scroll down and find, let's go with this multi-gang plate, and this is going to be similar to our box. So we'll have quantity, and then I want the same thing. I want the variable for gangs. Once we add that, we can take off this assembly again, and we can see that it's only going to ask me for the gangs once, but if I choose, let's say, a single gang, take off one of these, and it gets committed. If I open up our summary screen, we can see that since I use the same variable for both items, the gang variable for both the plate and the box, they're both going to get that single selection applied to both of them. So you don't need to necessarily have a variable per item. If you want, you can use that one variable to go into the selection for multiple items. So let's go back here and let's add our morettes. And let's add these morettes here. So we'll double click. And for this one, we're going to have quantity times 2. So I want 2 morettes, or maybe you want 3 morettes per box. So we're going to add that in. And then that's what's going to come in. However many times we're clicking, however many receptacles we're taking off. If we take off 5 of them, we're going to end up with 15 morettes here. So that's how the formulas work. That's how you're going to enter in variables, formulas, when you're creating these custom assemblies. Now let's take a look at using text items as a selection to choose which items go into your assembly. So to do this, I'm going to make a new assembly, and we're going to call this LED light, and this is an assembly. And when I open this up, we're going to add in here our LED lights. So this is going to be equal to quantity. And this fixture type, we have two options, trough and LED. So I'm going to select one for now as a placeholder, but we're not going to leave that there. We're going to add in a variable here. And what I want to do is, depending on which type of light fixture it is, a trough or an LED, I want to put a different box inside my assembly depending on which one I select. So let's call this box selection. And this is going to be a text type because we're going to select which text it is. So I'm going to add that in. And then we're going to add in our device box. We're going to add two of them. So I'm going to pick this one as the first one. And for the sake of this demo, let's force the number of gangs. And then let's pick a different one here. So we have our two boxes entered in. So now what we want to do is we're going to edit our LED lights, because this is what we're going to select from. And we're going to use our box selection here. And instead of being the quantity, we're just going to set this to 1. And now for our boxes, we're going to edit the formula. And this is going to look a little bit different. And there are some specific restrictions with this formula, just because we're using text variables as a selection tool here. So this is kind of the most advanced thing you might do with the system, but let's take a look at how we would lay this out. What we're going to do is we're going to use if statements in both of these formulas, and we're going to say, if I select the trough, I want this deep box, and if I select the LED, I want this regular box. And whichever one I select, I don't want the other. So let's do this box first. And we're just going to select a single gang. And we'll redo the formula, always starting with an equal sign. And what this is going to look like is if, and then we're going to do an open bracket. And then when I type in our variable for box selection, the one difference we have to do here is because we're selecting a text selection inside this box selection variable, we have to put this in quotation marks. Let's use a square bracket there. So now that's in quotation marks. So if we're saying if the text selection inside this box selection variable is equal to, which is two equal signs, and then we're going to say trough. And this also has to be in quotation marks because we're saying if this text variable that we're selecting in box selection is specifically equal to trough, spelled like that, then we do a comma, and we're going to say if it's equal to that, we're going to get a quantity. Then another comma to say if it's not equal to that, we want 0 of them. And then we close the bracket. So there's a couple things here. We're saying if this box selection is equal to trough, if that's true, then after the comma, we're going to count the quantity. If it's false, after the second comma, we get 0 of them. One other thing to note is that this text trough has to be in small letters. You can't have any capital letters if you're using a text variable in an if statement. This is a current limitation in the software. It's a very specific limitation, but you need to have all small letters. And the way this looks, if I go and open up our item for this LED lights, we can see here I have trough and LED with small letters. If there were any capital letters in here, this will not work. You need to redo that line with all small letters. So let's confirm this. And then let's do the same thing for this other device box. And to make life a little easier, I'm going to copy this, open this up, and I'm going to paste this in. And this came in with a little bit of extra spaces in the beginning. I'm going to delete that and be sure to put my equal sign in. And then we'll come over here, and we don't want this one to be trough. We want this one to be LED. So this is saying if the box selection is equal to LED, then if that's true, we're going to count a quantity. And if it's false, we're going to get 0. So let's confirm that. Now let's go take a look at takeoff and let's try this out. So I'm going to select my LED light. I have my box selection. So let's take off one with trough. And let's do another one with LED. And then let's go take a look at our summary screen. And here we can see we've added one of the deep boxes and then a second one of the regular gangs because we used one of those with our receptacle as well. So now there's 2 of those. So we've added in the correct amount with our takeoff of 1 each. So coming back to our assembly editor here, this is the most complicated type of assembly you're going to come across using these if statements. If you have any issues creating these or any other assemblies, please feel free to contact us for help. We're happy to help you, and we're here to help you. You can email us or call us, of course, but we also have this help button on many pages in Quantify, and if you just click that little question mark, you can type out your question or your email, and you can just click send, and it'll get to us, and we'll get back to you. That's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.